Hi, I'm Lidia Lae, a psychologist, writer, and speaker passionate about empowering people to lead meaningful, purpose driven lives. Welcome to another episode of Culture Shapers, where we explore powerful ideas and share inspiring stories from world experts, authors, leaders, creators, and influencers who are shaping culture and making an impact on society. My guest today is Heather Cetrangolo. She's a dedicated action researcher and specialist in mindset change. She's the creator of Systemic Renewal, a research methodology for renewing identity at individual, organizational, and societal levels simultaneously. Welcome, Heather. It's wonderful to have you join us today and talk
Yeah,
about the heart of systemic renewal. Share
yeah.
with us anything I haven't covered in your bio and your story.
Ah, is there anything you haven't covered? Oh, I'm sure there is. But yeah, Lydia, it's a real privilege to share with you. And, I'm a fan of your work. So I think the intersection of systemic change and culture
Yes.
is so important. So I'm keen to see what will come out of today. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Heather. Heather,
Mm.
just share with us what does this term mean to you, systemic renewal, and how do you see it shaping cultural transformation at both the individual and collective levels?
Yeah. Well, it's been a bit of a journey with me and my team coming up with the name for what we do, systemic renewal. So it's a great question to start with. We've been through many iterations and many discussions, and multiple times we've looked at dropping it and changing it to something else, and then we've constantly come back to the phrase systemic renewal. So with starting something new, it's really kind of, I guess one of the challenges for us is it's not a term people immediately know what that means or immediately recognize, right? And the
Correct.
reason for that is because it is new. It is a new framework for leading systemic change. And in fact, it's a new framework for how to lead communities or sectors that are run down, disordered, where there's broken trust or where there's a lack of resources, a feeling of struggling, scrambling for resources, where there's systems that aren't working as well as they once did, right? Instead
Yes.
of looking at as change management or change leadership, which is traditionally, I guess, the most of the approaches that we lean on when we're going through transition, we're introducing a different but complementary process that we believe from our research and experience kind of helps communities to really flourish against the odds, even when
Mm,
they are under-resourced and very stretched and very worn out, or where
mm.
there's a feeling of we've tried everything and nothing's quite cracking it.
Yes.
So, what kind of came out of my research, but also my life story, was a conviction that there's a different kind of leadership that's needed for social and organizational change in the hardest places to happen.
Yes.
And it's not that change leadership isn't needed, but it's just that it's not the only kind of leadership that's needed. So I call it renewal. So it's systemic in the sense that it does draw from systems change theory and practice. It
Yes.
does draw from organizational change theory. We do look at how to map and understand a system and identify the best leverage points for change. But it's also got this other side, which we call renewal, which is different to change in that change is kind of about how we get from A to B. It's kind of like saying we've got these strategic goals, how are we going to get there, and giving it a map and stepping it out
Mm,
with measurable KPIs and all the rest. Renewal is sort of about saying, well, before we even do that, which we do need to do, we've got to go almost back to a step that comes before strategic planning and
yes.
revisit our identity as a community,
I
actually.
love
Who
that.
are we at the core?
Yes.
Um, who are we? What have our strengths always been in our story?
Yes.
What do we uniquely bring to the world or gift to the world? And how do we kind of get back to core business in a way that's going to relate to today?
Yes.
So you could say, in a way, that there's a bridge of science and spirituality in the work.
Mm,
And I'm nervous to say the word spirituality because I know it's triggering in positive and negative ways for people depending on their experience. But what I've found is that so many leaders are saying, I kind of want to be able to draw from the great sort of
mm,
leaders of social change, of spiritual leaders, people who've had a way of changing our hearts and minds to get back to who we really are, but also
mm.
in a way that's very scientific and evidence-based and not necessarily religious.
Yes.
So my mission has become to create that and provide that, and that's systemic renewal.
That's wonderful, Heather. I
Mm,
just love how you get back to the heart of identity. And
yeah.
very much in my own PhD research, getting back to narratives, it is
Mm,
actually what makes up identity. And
mhm,
understanding the story at such a molecular level and identifying why do we exist?
mhm,
Why? And it's that why that's a huge question that all of us in many ways needs to ask in order to know what changes then can you make to recover that identity. And I love how you bring that holistic approach. And as a psychologist, I
mhm,
know that that word spiritual, yes, can be quite triggering, but we're also quite accepting now. And Engel's approach of the biopsychosocial spiritual model for health of individual
mhm,
recognizes that there is that spiritual component to many of
mm,
us. And
mm.
what you're dealing in the systemic level comes back to the individual level. And so,
100%, 100%,
yes,
yeah. So I
I
think
love
you
your
asked me,
approach.
about the connection between individual, organizational, and sector-wide, those layers of change. And the reason they're integrated is because identity is always existing on those three levels, right? We
I
have
totally agree.
right, yeah. So to lead a shift in identity, or a return to our true identity, we have to do that at all three levels,
Mm,
essentially, is what my research uncovered. And then I looked at ways that leaders who manage to do that well, what their techniques are, what they actually do. But I think it's so true. You know, Brené Brown, I think she's someone that's
yes,
helped, well, spirituality being a factor in sort of resilience
correct.
in vulnerability in her research in that field, it's kind of shown us that it's a key factor in the lives of people who express high levels of resilience and an ability to kind of stay in hard places and flourish in
Mm,
harsh conditions. And I think she defines it as, I'm not going to say this 100% correctly, but a sense that we're connected to all of humanity and to a greater vision or purpose. It's something close to those lines, which we
yes.
can all kind of connect to, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely can resonate with that because I think we're all in this collective.
Mm,
Um, not only the cultures that we're part of, right? But that we're creating, but there's also a higher sense that we know is behind all of this. And I think there's a lot of researchers now acknowledging that. And I certainly know from doing the artist way with Julia Cameron how she also talks about that we're just merely vessels.
mm,
This creativity, right, comes from the creative source. So
mhm,
just
mhm,
very fascinating. There's converging scientific evidence and research
yep,
about this whole aspect of identity being greater than just an individual identity. There's
mhm,
also what you're working with, which is very much a collective identity of the organization. And
mhm,
I love how you're actually looking at the hard places and
mhm,
focusing on resilience. So I
mhm.
want to know, Heather, like what are the biggest obstacles that you've encountered in your work and how do you navigate them while staying committed to cultural renewal?
Wow. Okay, that's a great question. Well, you know, I'm going to say the first answer that comes straight from my heart. And as I think back to the memories of some of the hardest leadership positions that I've been in terms of leading renewal. This is going to sound probably all at once unpopular, but very true, right? Is that the hardest thing is being when you're in a position where you have to work with people who actually aren't on board with the core vision or identity of the organization, and they're basically pushing against it. Or at worst, having to work alongside people who hold positions of power who maybe are quite dysfunctional, maybe very narcissistic, maybe very
Yes.
unwell, maybe really just not very socially or emotionally mature. These
Mm,
are realities, right? So
correct.
honestly,
We all know that.
I think it's, and I think, I was working last year with a group in Switzerland of people from different sectors. And
Yes.
the thing that all these senior managers were saying one day they had in common was the feeling that they don't, the feeling of being micromanaged or not having enough
Mm,
capacity to say, can we do it like this? Or can we change it? Or can I structure my own time or my own role a little bit differently? Working for people who just kind of just like squash creativity, aren't open to change, aren't very human centered in the way that they work. It's hard. It's one of the
mm,
main reasons people leave their job, right?
correct.
So, okay, so that's one of the main challenges. What I've found in my research, and also just from the different communities I've worked with in the last 20 years, really since I was a kid, because this has always been in me,
Yes.
is that we have to work around it. And to do that, there's a very specific technique that I teach leaders. I call it the table. So there are 4 disciplines in our practice. One of them I call the table, and it's the skill of being able to gather the right people to work together in the right way.
Mm,
And we look at specifically how you discern that, and what does that mean, the right people? What are the experiences and character requirements and commitments that are needed from a person who's going to really go on the journey of renewal with you and
yes.
back you and be part of a team? So the key strategy that I always use is to build a team for renewal that sits alongside an organization or a sector or a system,
Mm-hmm.
that can be as small as 2 or 3 people at first.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't actually have an official decision-making role in the system. So they don't in any way interfere directly with all of those structures, decision-making structures and flows of information that are already in place. They kind of come alongside almost like a friend
Yes.
and start to do excellent work together. And what happens is it's almost like putting yeast into the dough. As
Mm,
this team work together in a particular way and through rhythms that we teach, it's like the new way of being starts to just kind of like sprout in small ways and then gradually build momentum until, in fact, the culture is shifting in such a way that those senior managers can't necessarily stop it.
well, that's powerful.
Mm.
It's,
Yeah. And it
yeah.
seems very subvertive, but it's not in a way, because what we do is always honor and respect the hierarchy. And in a way, those difficult people, we still honor and respect their position and who they are and their humanity, and work with it, but
Yes.
in a way that is going to actually start to influence and shift the cultural push that's going on
Mm.
within the system. And it is possible to do that.
Well,
Mm,
that is really powerful because it's not about then like blaming the one individual person in that system or isolating them, but it's actually looking at the whole macro level and changing that because people conform, right, to cultural norms. And then
100%.
they, in time, just go along with it. So
Mm, mhm.
attitudes then change and behaviors and thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you're recovering back the identity. So, and I love
Mm,
how you explain that so clearly, how you actually effect change. Because I was
mm,
going to ask you, like, was there like a powerful example that you could use of what has actually happened with systemic renewal in practice, where a shift
mm,
actually happened in mindset or policy or at the leadership
yeah.
level to lead to that cultural change?
Yeah. Gosh, there are so many examples I could think of. And part of me is always a bit, oh, I've got to respect the confidentiality of the groups I've
Totally
worked with.
understand that.
But I'll just tell you a very general example from when I was working with international students,
Yes.
which was a 4-year period, because I'm someone who I kind of have this heart for renewal, right? So I often move to different communities to help the renewal happen, then I move to the next, which is a characteristic of this kind of leader, actually. So I was in this space for 4 years with university students coming from Southeast Asia, from all different countries. And as we know, it's a mixed experience for them. It's very exciting to be able to go to university in Australia, but it's also full of a lot of financial and social pressures that international students face uniquely compared with local students, as well as just the cultural shift in their experience that they're going through at a young age often, and they're far from home and all the rest.
Mm,
So we know that those students experience higher rates of mental health issues and even suicidal ideation and those kinds of
mm,
experiences compared with the rates of local students because of the high pressure that they're under. So
right.
I was in a role which was initially as a chaplain, kind of evolved into more like a senior community development role in the organization, because what I could see was a gap in the system was the ability to provide opportunities for these young people to build community and to connect with local Australian leaders and organisations that would help them kind of sustain the journey in the long term and also
Mm,
start to build their employability for the long term so
yes.
that their journey in Australia can actually go the distance, if you like, and their dreams can be realised. And so I initially started with no team and a lot of resistance in the culture around, there's no funding for that.
Yes.
It's just not really a framework that we've worked from before. Usually student wellbeing is thought of in more of a how do we address the deficit model rather than what
Right.
could we build to enhance
Right.
wellbeing. So, how do we make sure that we've got the support structures in place that are needed when there is a crisis, as opposed to what could we build to prevent crisis or minimize the amount of crisis scenarios that we're managing. So,
Mm,
um, you know, I started with exactly this approach. I had one person who was an international student as a younger man, had now graduated and was working in Melbourne, come
mm.
back and want to work with me as a volunteer.
Oh, that's
So we already
wonderful.
have a team of two. That built, then I had another graduate, also was an international student at Melbourne who came on board as a volunteer. That was three.
Yes.
Over time, within 2 years, they both had full-time jobs at the
Yes.
college. And, we then built from there a student team, which in the end was about 80 students every year that were collaborating with us to build community development programs within the life of the student body. And
Oh,
we had
how
sponsorship from Bupa Australia and from other organisations. And we partnered with about 15 different community groups. And all of that happened
fantastic.
in this collaborative way until it was really in time it was seen as just a part of what we do here. This is just part
Mm,
of our offerings, and the community opportunities and development that we're doing is core to our strategy and student well-being. So, in a sense, if I was just trying to convince all of the senior level managers that this was an important shift to make in our approach, it wouldn't have got me very far. But by building a team on the ground and demonstrating what it could look like, and slowly that grew over time, before we
mm.
know it, that conversation never even needed to happen.
That is so, so powerful. I love it. I can see your passion shining through, Heather. And
It's my
a lot
favorite
of
topic.
people, yeah, but a lot of people don't know. But when I first met you, you were a lawyer.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
And
Yeah,
then
well,
you're an Anglican priest. And
yeah,
then you're, yeah, doing a researcher. And
yeah,
you've now also submitted your PhD. So well
yeah.
done to you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, it is that blend of being a lawyer and then studying. First, I studied actually religious studies. I wanted to learn about different spiritualities and religious ideas and traditions and writings. And then I decided in my 20s that I really wanted to specialize in the field that was where my heart and soul sat, in the Christian faith. And so I trained and became a minister. But I think the weird blend for me is that I've always had this one half of me very interested in the technical side of change. How do we change law and policy to make a difference in the world? And it is essential. But then this other side going, there's something about how we actually motivate people and how we lead mindset change that is critical as well. And I've always had these two parts of me kind of in tandem going on. I'd say now with my PhD, they've really finally come together into an integrated whole. And so it's systemic, it's technical, it's strategic, it's about policy, but then it's renewal. It's also got that inner life kind of dimension of understanding mindsets and how we help to lead mindset change. Mm.
That is so, so worthwhile what you're doing. And I can see that it's making a real difference in so many different people's lives. And I think the whole approach that you're taking is such on targeting in every different level and building that action team, which is
Mm.
very powerful. So
Mm.
I'm just very grateful, Heather, for the work that you're doing because I know that you love to tackle the hard places, the places where there's
Mm.
a lot of neglect and where there is, in dire need of change, transformation.
Mm.
And, I just applaud you for taking this massive step and being able to take on organizations or cultures where there needs to be an injection of life and change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the thing that I've, gradually realized as I'm now moving from years of playing at this, right, and working out what works and what doesn't, and making mistakes and learning from them, now I'm kind of in a season of passing this on to other leaders who kind of already do this kind of work. They're naturally inclined to it, but they've never had an evidence base to help them really succeed and flourish at it, or a community around them who resonate with the kind of leadership that they do. But yeah, there's mindset change. We know it sits at the roots of any systemic change. Donella Meadows, who's one of the founding thinkers, she puts it at the base of all the kind of levels and levers of systemic change that she's identified. And we know that, but nobody's really worked on the science of how that happens for
Mm,
groups and communities. And
yeah.
um, the last thing that ever works is, let's say I went to a senior management meeting and I did a presentation about how our policies on international students need to change because they're basically fueled by racism, which comes from our colonialist history, and that would be true. But it won't lead to a mindset change. It's not going to actually help move
Mm,
us into actually who we really are at our core, which is people who are passionate about cultural diversity, passionate about our Southeast Asian neighbours, passionate about the future of Australia that is inclusive of those neighbours shaping and co-creating our future. So at our
mm,
core, that is who we are. We can celebrate that and move towards that, without necessarily people feeling deconstructed or criticized.
mm. That's right. It's a real celebration of our multiculturalism as Australians. And I love what you shared about the way that you're bringing in a research-based scientific approach. And I want to ask you, give us three takeaways for the audience in terms of bringing about this systemic renewal. What are
Mm.
three key things that they could, do or implement to activate that change?
Yeah. I can give you four because systemic renewal consists of four disciplines, and that's our logo's got four little flames, so it symbolizes the four. But I won't unpack them, but I'll just give you like a tip from each one that you could pick up and use straight away, even if you never learned the whole method. So the first I call it the mountain, the table, the green room, and the stage. The mountain is about, as counterintuitive as it is, instead of getting your team to brainstorm ideas, put post-it notes on the wall, map the system, and try to identify strategic changes they could make, the first thing to do is never that. The first thing to do is spend as much time as you can with individuals and understand their experience of the system, and
Mm.
start to identify what are the repeat experiences, whether someone's in governance, management, or on the factory floor, what are the repeat experiences that they're having of the system? Because
Mm.
that's where your most important information is about what heart change is needed.
Yes.
So you focus on individuals, even though it feels like it's a waste of time. It's actually the best time spent. The second
Mm.
is the table. So it's find the right people to work with confidentially off to the side of the system, and don't be afraid if that's only one or two people at first.
Mm-hmm.
The third is the green room, which is like the place where you prepare to go on stage, right, and then recover when you come off stage. And what I've realized from my work is that preparing for how you're going to present an idea and
Yes.
scripting it really well in a way that's going to resonate with the audience is half the work. So we usually skip that stage in change management. We just go straight to changing strategies and policies. But actually, we need a narrative first that's
Yes.
very
Totally
convicting.
agree.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
right, even if you put it in one sentence, tell me in one sentence what we're going to do differently. That's going to make me feel so excited. I could get out of bed early every morning for that. And if you've got that one sentence, that's your starting point. And then the stage, the principle there is that, and this is the hardest part, people have to see you do the thing first before
Yes.
they will jump on board. So before trying to convince senior leaders that there needs to be a change in policy, new funding, um, you got to do the thing. So actually demonstrate it in some way. And once
Mm.
they see an example, that's when the money comes.
Yeah, and that's where the real kind of individual voice in action in that example that then is visible to everyone of how
Mm,
it could be done.
yep,
And so love the four takeaways.
there's four
And
takeaways.
yeah, no, that's awesome because you have outlined the change transformative stages to actually bring about a systemic change. And so that's in very, very easy, kind of understandable language as well.
So Lydia, in your work that you're doing around culture and shaping culture, what resonates the most in terms of those different areas I've shared for your in your
The,
work?
yeah, it has a lot of parallels to what you've just brought up, that it really only takes one individual, right, their voice to effect change. But my whole research focused on self narratives, and I realized the powerful medium of narratives that
Mm,
in many ways make up our cultures and make up ourselves. So we're effectively made up of words. And if,
mm,
the only way that we are remembered, right, is from the
mm,
story that we have lived.
yeah.
I mean, one day you and I will leave this earth, will
Mm,
leave this world. And the only way people are going to remember us is the stories, our
mm,
experiences, what we've done with our lives, and the way that we've made people feel. And
mm,
these are all wrapped up in narratives because the only way we ever knew about our history is through the narratives.
mm,
So definitely that narrative, which I love when you mentioned going into the green room and getting that script, getting that narrative right. That is so
mm,
powerful. And all of us come pre-wired into this world. I think it was Noam Chomsky that mentioned that with language. We come
mm,
pre-wired with language, and there's just something very powerful about language.
mm.
I know that
100%.
certainly, yeah, the people who have moved me to action are the ones who are great orators,
Mm,
that their lives actually match their words.
mm,
They shared a vision through their words, but they actually lived out the vision.
mhm,
The reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is that I really want to see cultural change for the better.
Mm,
individuals making a meaningful contribution to culture so that we all live in a world where we're valued, we're heard, we can feel that we're making a difference. There is significance to each individual lives, which is why I get very excited about the work you're doing, Heather,
mhm,
wanting
mhm,
to bring this transformation, this change in very difficult organizations or communities.
mm,
It's just a
mm.
very vital work because you are actually changing not only lives, but communities.
Yeah. Well, I just thought of a story to bounce off my time with international students that um, what you were sharing just then reminded me of. Maybe it's nice to finish with this picture of what we're talking about. We had a student, I remember, who had an eating disorder and had been struggling with a range of mental health issues for some years. As far as we could tell, this student came from actually a very supportive uh, stable home
Yes.
and had financial support, so there were obviously other complex factors going on. So I worked in my role there with a team of other psychologists, counselors, social workers, and people that specialized in providing that kind of support, which is not my area of expertise, not what I do. And so this student was someone that was receiving a lot of support from the team for some years, and they improved and came out of hospital and began to improve a lot in their health and well-being. And there was
Mm.
a moment where we ran a big party for students, which the team that I had built was hosting, and they design it, the theme, the invitations, the marketing, the activities on the night, the food, the music, everything. And they would host it to say, like, we want to put this event on for you to have fun and celebrate your time here in Australia. And they wanted to do some talent show as part of the evening, I remember, and students did dance performances and music performances. And we were literally on grass with like disco lights all around us and hundreds of students. There would have been 500 students there that night, all in this big circle on the lawn. And this student decided to perform a song. And it was just not everyone there would have known what a big deal it was for this
Mm.
student to get up and share their voice in this way and stand in front of their peers and do this. But it was such a moment of I'm still standing, and
That's so
and
touching.
they were amazing. And so the performance wasn't amazing, not really, but everyone just cheered and cheered and cheered and cheered for them. And I felt like this was a moment where the narrative has literally shifted, where it's not either we have clinical practice and clinical support services, or we have kind of these fringy, emergent kind of community development strategies. It's literally the two coming together and working together in a cohesive way. And that's a narrative shift in itself, right? That
Right.
happened
And
right
that's
there in that moment. Mm,
correct. And that the courage that it took her to stand up and to sing. Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, after all that she'd been through.
It's systemic renewal because it's an individual story, but it's also a community story in terms of how that's changing our identity and the way
Correct.
that we relate, and it's always happening in
Yes.
at the
Love
same
that
time.
story, Heather. Love
Mm,
it.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Heather, for
Oh,
coming on
good.
Culture Shapers today. You're a real culture
Mm,
shaper.
thanks.
And yeah, would love to have your link of your website for this program. So feel
Great.
free to check out Heather's work and reach out to her.
Mhm.
And for any other resources, just feel free to log on www.lidialae.com. There's free resources about being a culture shaper, how to affect cultural change. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for
And
having me.
oh, you're most welcome. Thank you.
All
Very
the best. All
grateful for
right.
the story that you've shared and about the work that you're doing. Such powerful work. Thank you,
Thank
Heather.
you. All right.
Thank you.